The moment they laugh at you is the moment they think they've already won. The revolving door slid open with a low mechanical hum, and Marcus Reed stepped inside without slowing down, one hand steady, the other holding onto something smaller, something quieter. His daughter's fingers wrapped around his, like she wasn't sure she should be there. Like the air itself felt different the second they crossed the threshold. Colder somehow, sharper, and it didn't take long. Not even 3 steps before the first glance landed. Then another. Then a pause, just long enough for recognition to turn into judgment. Because rooms like this didn't need announcements. They decided things instantly, silently, and then someone let out a short laugh. Not loud, not bold, just careless enough to spread. And it did, quickly, bouncing from one man to another, until it filled the polished space with something Marcus had heard before. Something he didn't react to now, because reacting would mean it mattered. And he had learned a long time ago what mattered and what didn't. But his daughter shifted slightly closer to him, her sneakers making a faint sound against the marble floor. Her voice small when it came, almost swallowed by the noise around them. "Daddy, are we in the wrong place?" He didn't answer right away, just crouched slightly, adjusting the sleeve of her jacket, smoothing it out, like that was the only thing that needed fixing, like everything else could wait. And for a moment, just a moment, the room didn't exist. Not the suits, not the eyes, not the laughter that was still lingering in the background. And then he stood again, calm, steady, like nothing had changed. And maybe that was what made it worse for them, because people expected a reaction, a defense, a reason to justify what they were already thinking. But Marcus gave them none of it, and that silence stretched, heavy in a different way now, enough that 1 or 2 of them stopped smiling without understanding why. While across the lobby, a man with a clipboard glanced up, frowned, then looked back down, like maybe he had made a mistake, like the name in front of him didn't belong to the man standing there. And above it all, high behind a wall of glass, Victoria Hale stood with her arms folded, the faint shift of fabric at her shoulder, catching the light as she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the floor with practiced precision, dismissing most of what she saw within seconds, until it paused, just briefly, on him, not because of what he wore or how he stood, but because something about him didn't match the reaction he was getting, and that inconsistency stayed there, quiet, unresolved, while below, the voice of security cut through the noise, calling names, pairing candidates, building anticipation for something they all thought they understood, something predictable, controlled, until that voice hesitated just a fraction longer before reading the last name. Marcus Reed, dragging it slightly, like it didn't fit the rhythm, like it had been saved for a reason. And Marcus stepped forward, gently releasing his daughter's hand, placing it on the edge of a nearby chair, his touch light, but certain, and she held onto it like it was an anchor, watching him now, really watching him, while the room leaned in just enough to see what would happen next. Convinced they already knew, convinced this was about to be over before it began. And Marcus didn't rush, didn't hesitate, just moved forward into a space that had already decided against him, carrying with him something they couldn't name yet, something that didn't belong to the story they had already written. And somewhere above, Victoria's eyes narrowed just slightly, because for the first time that morning, something didn't add up. Names were called one after another, clean and confident, each man stepping forward with a posture that said he belonged, that he had done this before, that this room made sense to him. And the energy shifted with every pairing, laughter fading into focus, into competition, into something sharper, while Marcus stood slightly apart from it all, not outside the room, not disconnected, just not participating in the rhythm everyone else seemed to follow. And that difference stayed there, quiet, but visible, like a detail no one wanted to acknowledge, but could not ignore either. And near the reception desk, his daughter sat still, hands folded in her lap the way she did when she was trying not to be noticed, her eyes moving carefully from one face to another, studying reactions she did not fully understand, but could feel, because children always feel it first. The change in tone, the weight behind a look, the way people decide things without saying them out loud. And she shifted slightly when a group of men nearby chuckled again, softer this time, like the joke had already passed, but the aftertaste remained. And Marcus noticed without looking, his head angled just enough to register the sound, the distance, the intention. And then he did something small, something almost invisible. He moved half a step, so she was no longer in their direct line of sight. A quiet adjustment that required no words. And she relaxed just a fraction, enough to breathe normally again. While across the room, the security lead flipped through his clipboard with practiced impatience, announcing the next round, pairing candidates with a tone that made it clear this was more than a process. It was a filter, efficient, deliberate. And when he reached the final page, he paused. Not long, just long enough to draw attention, to let the silence form around the moment. And then he looked up directly at Marcus, holding the gaze for a second longer than necessary before speaking his name again, slower this time, as if confirming it belonged to the man standing there. And a few heads turned, some curious now, instead of dismissive, because repetition changes perception. It forces people to look twice. And Marcus stepped forward without hesitation, his pace steady, neither fast nor slow, and the floor seemed quieter beneath him. Or maybe it was the room that had shifted, the sound pulling back just enough to make space for something else, something not yet understood. And above, behind the glass, Victoria adjusted her stance slightly, one hand resting along her arm as she leaned forward a fraction. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to see more clearly, because there was a pattern to these things, a structure she trusted, and yet this one detail refused to align with it. The way he moved, the absence of urgency, the lack of performance. It did not match the environment, and that inconsistency lingered, unresolved, as the security lead spoke again, announcing the pairing that drew a different kind of reaction from the room. A subtle shift in posture, a few exchanged glances, because the name that followed Marcus's was one everyone recognized, one associated with certainty, with outcomes that did not need explanation. And that reaction spread quickly, not loud, not exaggerated, just enough to signal that something about this moment mattered more than the others. And Marcus did not look around, did not measure the response. He simply stopped where he was directed. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing even, like the weight of expectation did not reach him. While behind him, his daughter leaned forward slightly in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge again, watching closely now, because even without understanding the rules, she could feel that something important was about to happen. And for the first time since they walked in, the room was no longer laughing. It was waiting. And that difference, that shift from dismissal to attention, changed everything, without anyone saying a word. The man they paired him with did not rush forward, did not need to, because confidence like his did not come from speed. It came from certainty. And Derek Shaw carried that certainty in the way he stood, shoulders loose, jaw relaxed, eyes already half dismissing what stood across from him, like the outcome had been decided long before this moment. And the room responded to that energy without thinking. Subtle shifts in posture, small nods, the quiet agreement of people who had seen this before and expected the same result again. While Marcus Reed stood opposite him, without mirroring any of it. No stance, no adjustment, just stillness. The kind that did not try to prove anything. The kind that made the space between them feel different, without anyone being able to explain why. And that difference lingered, pressing lightly against the edges of the moment. While near the wall, his daughter leaned forward just enough that her feet lifted slightly off the floor, her eyes fixed on him, not blinking, not moving, as if she was trying to memorize something she did not yet understand. And Marcus did not look back at her, not because he forgot, but because he did not need to. The awareness was already there, steady, constant, like everything else about him. And Derek finally took a step closer, slow, deliberate, testing the distance, testing the reaction, waiting for something to confirm what he already believed. And when nothing came, when Marcus did not shift, did not react, did not offer anything back, Derek smiled slightly, a small change, almost polite, but not quite, and he said something under his breath, something meant only for the space between them, something that would normally draw a response. But Marcus did not answer, not even a glance, just a quiet inhale, controlled, measured, like the moment had already been calculated. And that was when it changed. Not the situation, not the pairing, but the perception. Because silence like that does not feel like uncertainty. It feels like choice. And choice makes people hesitate, even if only for a fraction of a second. And Derek hesitated, barely noticeable, just enough for the rhythm to shift. While above them, Victoria Hale leaned forward another inch, her attention no longer divided, no longer scanning, now fixed entirely on what stood in front of her. Because something about the timing felt wrong. The lack of urgency, the absence of performance, the way Marcus occupied the space without claiming it. It did not match the pattern she trusted. And patterns were how she made decisions, how she stayed in control. And right now, that control felt slightly out of reach, like a detail she could not quite resolve. While the security lead stepped back, giving them space, the signal clear without words, and the room settled into a quiet that was heavier than before. Not the casual silence of waiting, but the kind that builds when expectations begin to crack, when people start to question what they thought they understood. And Marcus finally moved. Not toward Derek, not away, just a small adjustment, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Simple, almost insignificant, but it carried something with it. Something that did not belong to this room. Something practiced, something precise. And for a brief moment, just a brief one, Derek's expression changed. Not enough for most to notice, but enough for those who were paying attention. Because confidence reacts when it meets something unfamiliar. And this felt unfamiliar, even if no one could say why. And the room held that moment, stretched thin between assumption and realization. Not yet broken, not yet clear, just waiting for the next thing to happen. And no one there understood that the next few seconds would rewrite everything they thought they knew. The distance between them did not close all at once. It narrowed in pieces, measured, controlled, like both men were aware that something more than a simple test was unfolding. And Derek shifted his stance again, subtle but deliberate, adjusting his footing on the polished surface as if recalibrating. Not because he doubted himself, but because something about Marcus did not behave the way it should. And that kind of inconsistency demands attention, even from someone used to winning. While Marcus remained exactly where he was, shoulders loose, gaze steady, not locked onto Derek in a confrontational way, but present, aware, as if he was seeing more than just the man in front of him. And that difference created a tension that did not need noise to exist. It lived in the space between breaths, in the pause before movement, in the way the room leaned in without realizing it. And near the wall, his daughter shifted again, her small hands tightening around the edge of the chair, her eyes moving between them, searching for something familiar, something that would tell her how this would end. But there was nothing familiar about this moment. Not anymore. And that uncertainty sat with her, quiet but heavy. While above them, Victoria did not move at all now, her posture fixed, her attention fully anchored. Because the pattern had broken completely, this was no longer a predictable sequence, no longer a simple evaluation. And she felt that shift not as a thought, but as a sensation, a slight tightening in her chest, a change in her breathing that she corrected almost immediately, but not before noticing it. And that alone was enough to hold her there, watching, calculating again, searching for something she could define. While below, Derek finally closed the last step of distance. Not aggressively, not recklessly, just enough to force an interaction, to draw a reaction. And his hand moved slightly, not striking, not committing, just testing. A controlled gesture meant to establish presence, to remind Marcus of the gap between them. And for a fraction of a second, it looked like nothing would happen. Like Marcus would remain exactly as he was, absorbing the motion without acknowledgement. But then he shifted, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, his weight transferring with precision, his body aligning in a way that did not belong to hesitation. And that was the moment it changed. Not through impact, not through force, but through timing. Because Derek's expression altered again, just slightly, the confidence still there, but now layered with something else, something quieter, something closer to recognition, as if a part of him understood that the situation was no longer simple, that the man in front of him was not reacting because he could not, but because he was choosing not to. And choice like that does not come from uncertainty. It comes from control. And control shifts power, even before anything visible happens. And the room felt it, even if they could not explain it. The laughter was gone now, completely gone, replaced by a silence that carried weight, expectation, and something close to doubt. While Marcus remained steady, his breathing unchanged, his focus unbroken. And in that stillness, there was a quiet certainty, something that did not need to be proven out loud, something that simply waited for the right moment. And somewhere in that waiting, in that narrow space between movement and reaction, everything began to tilt, just slightly, just enough that the outcome no longer felt guaranteed. And that was the moment the room stopped watching a test and started witnessing something else entirely. It did not happen the way anyone expected. Not loud, not dramatic, not with the kind of movement people could easily follow. It happened in a space too small to measure, in a moment too brief to break down. And for those watching, it felt less like an action and more like something missing, like a step had been skipped that their eyes could not catch. Because 1 second Derek was certain, grounded, fully in control of the space he had dominated countless times before. And the next, that certainty shifted, not shattered, not broken, just redirected in a way that made no sense to the room. And Marcus was no longer where he had been a fraction of a second earlier. His position adjusted just enough. His presence aligned in a way that removed the advantage Derek thought he had. And that change carried through the entire room like a quiet shock. Not because of what they saw, but because of what they did not understand. And Derek reacted, instinctively, adjusting again, trying to recover the rhythm he was used to controlling. But the rhythm was already gone, replaced by something else, something slower and more precise, something that did not rely on speed or force, but on timing. And timing is something you feel before you recognize. And by the time you recognize it, it is already too late to correct. And Marcus did not chase the moment, did not press forward. He simply allowed it to unfold. His movements minimal, efficient, almost restrained, as if he was doing less rather than more. And that restraint made it harder to follow, harder to predict, because the room was used to visible effort, to displays that confirmed what they believed. But there was no display here, no effort they could point to, only a quiet sequence that ended with Derek no longer in control of the exchange. His posture altered, his footing no longer as certain as before, and the silence that followed was immediate, complete, because the room could not process what it had just witnessed. Not yet, not fully. And Marcus stepped back slightly, creating space again, not claiming anything, not acknowledging the shift, just resetting to the same calm stillness he had started with, as if nothing significant had happened. And that was what made it heavier, because everyone else felt the change. Everyone else understood that something had just been rewritten, but he did not react to it at all. And near the wall, his daughter exhaled a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her shoulders lowering just a fraction. Her eyes still locked on him, searching for confirmation, and Marcus gave it without turning. A subtle tilt of his head, barely noticeable, but enough, always enough. And above them, Victoria did not move, but her expression had changed, not visibly to anyone else, not in a way that could be described easily, but internally, something had shifted. The clean structure she relied on, no longer holding, replaced by a question she could not ignore. Because this was no longer about a candidate performing well or poorly. This was about something else entirely, something she had not accounted for. And as the security lead stepped forward, clearing his throat slightly as if to restore order, his voice did not carry the same certainty as before. The authority still there, but thinner now, less absolute. And he looked at Marcus differently, not dismissing, not overlooking, but assessing, for real this time, because the room had changed. The assumptions had shifted, and what stood in front of them was no longer an outlier to be removed, but a variable they did not understand. And Marcus remained exactly where he was, quiet, composed, present, as if he had expected this all along. And in that stillness, there was something deeper, something unresolved, something that made the moment feel incomplete, like the outcome they had just seen was only the beginning of something much larger. And no one in that room realized yet how far that shift would go. No one told them to stop, but they did anyway. The energy that had been building in the room, suddenly flattening into something quieter, heavier, like the space itself needed a second to catch up. And Derek stood there, not fallen, not defeated in any obvious way, but different. His posture no longer carrying the same certainty. His eyes fixed on Marcus with a new kind of attention, the kind that replaces assumption with calculation. And that shift alone was enough to change how everyone else saw it. Because certainty is contagious, but so is doubt. And now both were present in the room at the same time, pulling against each other, creating a tension that did not need movement to exist. While Marcus remained still, exactly where he had reset himself, shoulders relaxed, breathing even, as if the moment had already passed for him, as if whatever had just happened was simply part of a process he had completed long before stepping into this building. And that disconnect made it harder to place him, harder to define what he was in relation to everything else they understood. And near the wall, his daughter shifted again. But this time it was different. Her posture more upright, her grip less tight, her eyes still focused, but no longer searching for reassurance. Because she had already received it in the only way that mattered to her. Through consistency, through the quiet certainty her father carried, even when the room turned against him. And that certainty stayed with her now, grounding her in a space that had felt overwhelming just minutes ago. While across the floor, the security lead stepped forward again, slower this time. His voice measured when he spoke, not because he lacked authority, but because he was recalibrating it, adjusting to something he had not anticipated. And he glanced briefly at Derek, then back at Marcus, as if confirming what he had just witnessed, as if deciding how to categorize it. But there was no clear category to place it in, and that uncertainty lingered in his expression for a moment before he masked it, returning to procedure, to structure, to the framework that kept everything controlled. And yet the control felt thinner now, less absolute, as if the system itself had been questioned in a way it could not immediately answer. And above them, Victoria finally moved. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a single step back from the glass, her hand lifting slightly to rest along her arm, the fabric of her sleeve shifting with the motion, a small detail that mirrored the internal adjustment she was making, because what she had just seen did not align with the metrics she trusted, the patterns she used to evaluate risk and value. And when something falls outside of those patterns, it becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability is something she does not ignore. And she turned away from the glass slowly, not breaking her focus entirely, but shifting it inward, processing, recalculating, deciding what this meant in a larger context. Because this was no longer about a single candidate or a single moment. It was about a variable that could not be dismissed. And below, the room began to move again, not back to what it had been, but forward into something new. The candidates watching more carefully now, their expressions more reserved, their assumptions no longer as firm. Because once something breaks expectation, it changes how everything that follows is perceived. And Marcus remained unchanged within it. Steady, quiet, present, like the shift around him did not alter his position at all. And that consistency made him stand out even more. Not through action, but through absence of reaction. Through control that did not need to be proven. And as the next instruction began to form on the security lead's lips, as the process attempted to continue, there was a subtle awareness spreading through the room. Unspoken, but real. That whatever came next would not follow the same script. And Marcus Reed was the reason why. The room tried to move on, but it could not return to what it was. Not after that shift. Not after something unseen had quietly rewritten the rules without asking permission. And the next pair was called. Two candidates stepping forward with the kind of confidence that had filled the space earlier. But it felt different now. Thinner. Like a performance that no longer held the same weight. Because everyone had seen something they could not explain. And once that happens, certainty never comes back the same way. And Marcus stepped aside as instructed. Not looking at anyone. Not acknowledging the glances that followed him now. Because they were different too. No longer dismissive. No longer amused. But searching. Measuring. Trying to understand what category he belonged to. And he did not offer them anything to work with. Just the same calm presence. The same quiet control. While he returned to where his daughter sat. And she looked up at him immediately. Her eyes wide, but steady. Her voice soft when she spoke. Are we leaving? And he paused for a moment. Just long enough to consider something that did not show on his face. Then he shook his head slightly. A small answer, but enough. And she nodded like she trusted it completely. Because she always did. And he reached out, adjusting a strand of her hair that had fallen out of place. A simple gesture. Practiced. Consistent. And that consistency grounded her more than anything else in the room. While across the floor, Derek had not moved far, still standing where the moment had shifted. His attention no longer scattered, no longer outward, but focused, fixed on Marcus now in a way that suggested something deeper than curiosity, something closer to recognition. As if he had felt something in that exchange that did not belong to the environment they were in. And that feeling stayed with him, unresolved, while the security lead continued calling names, pushing the process forward, trying to re-establish rhythm. But even his voice carried a slight change, a carefulness that had not been there before. And above it all, Victoria did not return to her previous position. She remained where she was, just behind the glass. But her posture had shifted. Her weight balanced differently. Her attention no longer divided across the room, but anchored to one point. And that focus did not come from curiosity alone. It came from disruption, from something that challenged the framework she trusted. And she watched Marcus now, not as an outsider, not as a candidate to be filtered out, but as a variable that needed to be understood. And that difference changed everything about how she observed him, because now she was looking for patterns, for inconsistencies, for signs of something hidden beneath the surface. And what she found instead was a lack of noise, a lack of excess, a presence that did not try to impress or prove. And that absence made him harder to read, harder to predict. And unpredictability in her world was not ignored. It was investigated. And below, the room continued to move, but slower, more aware, each action carrying a second layer of attention, because now they knew something was off. Something had shifted, even if they could not define it. And Marcus remained at the center of that shift, without doing anything to claim it, standing beside his daughter, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, his gaze forward, his posture unchanged. And in that stillness, there was something quiet but undeniable, something that did not demand recognition, but earned it anyway. And as the next names were called, and the process tried to regain its structure, one thing had already been decided without anyone announcing it. This was no longer just a tryout, and Marcus Reed was no longer just another name on a list. She did not call his name right away, and that delay was intentional, because timing was something Victoria Hale understood better than most. And she had learned that the moment you choose to act matters just as much as how you act. So she watched a little longer, letting the room continue its adjusted rhythm, letting the candidates reveal how they had changed after what they witnessed. Because that shift told her more than any resume ever could. And what she saw confirmed it. Hesitation where there had been certainty, caution where there had been arrogance, and all of it traced back to one man standing quietly near the edge of the floor. One man who had not moved since stepping away, who had not spoken, who had not tried to claim anything. And that restraint held her attention more than any display of skill ever could. Because restraint requires control, and control at that level is never accidental. And she stepped away from the glass then, her heels soft against the floor as she moved toward the exit of the upper level, the fabric of her sleeve shifting slightly with each step, a subtle movement that mirrored the shift in her thinking. Because this was no longer about selecting the strongest or the fastest. This was about identifying something she had not planned for, something that could not be easily replaced once lost. And below, the security lead continued with the process, his voice steady again, but the weight behind it still lighter than before, as if he was aware that the room no longer responded to him the same way. And when he reached the next pause, when the sequence naturally created space for direction, he glanced upward without realizing it. And for the first time that morning, he did not speak immediately, because he felt it too, the shift in authority, the change in where the attention truly was. And the room followed that silence, heads turning slightly, attention pulling toward the staircase as Victoria appeared, descending without urgency, without announcement, but with a presence that restructured the space around her instantly. Conversation stopped, posture corrected, the air tightening just enough to signal that something had changed again. And she did not look at anyone else as she crossed the floor, her gaze fixed ahead, measured, controlled, until she stopped a few feet from Marcus, close enough now that the distance carried meaning. And for a moment, she said nothing, letting the silence form, letting him respond if he chose to. But he did not move, did not speak, just met the moment with the same quiet presence he had carried since he walked in. And that stillness held against hers without conflict, without submission, just balance. And it was that balance that made her speak. Her voice even, not raised, not softened, just precise. You adjusted before the movement started. And it was not a question, it was an observation. Something she had pulled from the moment others could not fully see. And Marcus held her gaze for a second. Not long, just enough to acknowledge that she had seen something real. And then he answered, not explaining, not elaborating, just stating, you cannot react to what you wait to see. And that line settled into the space between them. Simple, controlled, but layered with something deeper. Something that did not belong to this room alone. And Victoria felt it, not as agreement, not as challenge, but as confirmation. and her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The smallest adjustment in her stance, the kind that only happens when control meets something it cannot. Immediately categorize. And behind her, the room remained still, watching, aware that this was no longer part of the process they had been following. This was something else entirely, something that had stepped outside of it. And Marcus remained exactly where he was, unchanged by her presence, unchanged by the attention, his focus steady, his posture relaxed, as if none of it altered what mattered to him. And that consistency, that refusal to shift under pressure, told her more than anything else could, because people reveal themselves when the environment changes. And he had not revealed anything new, only reinforced what had already been there. And that made him not just different, but rare. And rare is something she does not ignore. And as she held that moment a second longer than necessary, as the room waited for direction, for decision, one thing became clear without being spoken. Whatever this was becoming, it had already moved beyond a simple evaluation. And she was the one who had just stepped into it. The silence did not break immediately after he spoke. It settled deeper, stretching across the room in a way that made every small movement feel louder than it should. And Victoria held his answer in place for a second longer than necessary, not because she needed more information, but because she was measuring something else entirely. The consistency of it, the absence of hesitation, the way he did not try to impress or persuade, just stated and stopped. And that restraint aligned with everything she had observed so far, creating a pattern she could not ignore. While behind her, the room remained still, waiting for direction that did not come right away, because this was no longer a moment she wanted to rush. And Marcus did not fill the silence either. He simply stood there, steady, present, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair where his daughter sat, his attention divided without appearing divided, aware of her, aware of the room, aware of her. And that balance held without strain, like something practiced over time rather than constructed for this moment. And his daughter looked between them, her eyes moving carefully, sensing the shift, without understanding it fully, but recognizing that something important was happening, something that had changed how the room saw her father. And that awareness settled into her posture, quiet but real. While across the floor, Derek had stepped back slightly, not retreating, just repositioning, his attention still fixed on Marcus, no longer dismissive, no longer casual, but attentive in a way that suggested he was rethinking everything he had assumed. And that change did not go unnoticed by the others, because once one person adjusts, it gives permission for the rest to do the same. And the room followed that shift, slowly, subtly, the collective perception turning without any announcement. And Victoria finally moved again, not stepping back, not breaking the distance, but angling slightly to the side, enough to change the dynamic between them, enough to remove the direct line of confrontation and replace it with something more measured, more deliberate. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that adjustment, still controlled, still precise, but now layered with intention. This was not supposed to happen here, and it was not an accusation, not a complaint, just a statement of fact, something she was acknowledging rather than correcting. And Marcus did not respond right away. His gaze steady, his posture unchanged. And when he did speak, it was the same as before. Minimal. Exact. It already did. And that answer closed something in the space between them, not ending the moment, but shifting it forward, because there was no argument to be made against it, no correction to apply. And Victoria held that for a second, then nodded once. A small movement, almost invisible, but enough to signal a decision forming. Not finalized, not declared, but real. And she turned slightly toward the security lead, who straightened instinctively, waiting. And she did not give him a full instruction. Not yet. Just a brief look that carried more weight than words. And he understood enough to step back, to pause the process without announcing it, because the process no longer mattered in the same way. And the room felt that shift immediately, the structure loosening, attention narrowing, everything pulling toward the same point again. And Marcus remained unchanged within it, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just present, while his daughter's hand moved slightly, resting over his fingers on the back of the chair. A small contact, grounding, and he did not look down, but his hand adjusted just enough to meet hers. And that quiet exchange existed beneath everything else, unnoticed by most, but constant. And Victoria saw it, not the detail itself, but the effect of it, the steadiness it created, and something in her expression softened for the briefest moment before returning to control, because she understood what that meant, what it required. And she took one step back then, creating space again, not distancing herself, but resetting the frame. And when she spoke the final time in that moment, it was not to the room, not to the process. It was directed at him. Clear, measured. You are not done here. And she turned without waiting for a response. Her movement clean, decisive, leaving the statement behind like a marker that could not be ignored. And Marcus watched her go for exactly 1 second before his attention returned forward, not chasing the moment, not reacting to the shift, just holding where he was, while the room remained suspended in that decision, understanding without being told that whatever came next would not follow the same path they had walked in with. And for the first time since the doors opened, the outcome was no longer something anyone in that room could predict.